It is a particularly great joy to me to be able to welcome Jeanelle Austin as our guest on Conversing. Jeanelle is someone who I first met as a student of mine in a class I was teaching at Fuller Seminary. But I quickly realized, even then, and certainly in all the years since then, that she is much more my teacher than my student, and that I have only benefited from what she has helped me to see and to understand in ways like few others. I feel deeply indebted for her instruction and for her example. She was a student at Fuller. She worked on the staff of Fuller. Before she left, she was the interim director of the Pinnell Center for Black Church Studies, and gave her life to Fuller in a way that was costly and difficult. She moved to Austin. She spent some time there and serving and trying to understand how to serve issues of racial justice in that context, and established herself as a coach and an advocate and a teacher in many different ways. And she's then, through circumstances that we'll investigate in our conversation, she then is now living in Minneapolis, and in her childhood bedroom today, as we have this conversation, having returned literally home, just blocks away from the intersection where George Floyd was murdered. And that is all part of why we're having her today. Jeanelle, thank you so much for coming on to Conversing.
Thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
You know, when I think about the years that you've been my instructor about issues of race, I could just point to so many things. Sometimes it's been in the heat of our agreements and disagreements. Sometimes it's been in the heat of demonstrations. Sometimes it's been in the context of deep sorrow. It's also been in the context of for me, deep gratitude and joy for who you are, how you are the person that you are, and the work that God has clearly given you to do. So I wonder if you could just set the stage a little bit. Let's start with the fact that now, in this unexpected, wholly unexpected way, you are speaking to me within just a few blocks of the George Floyd intersection, I'll call it, and the George Floyd Memorial, which we're going to talk about. But you're also sitting in your childhood bedroom. So you started here, and now you're back here doing such important work. So give listeners who don't know you just a little bit of a sketch of that huge arc, which has endless stories and details. But please give us some insights.
Absolutely. And just for language sake, we actually call the intersection George Floyd Square.
Great.
And for short, we just say the square.
Okay. Good. Thanks.
But yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in South Minneapolis. In this very room was my childhood room. There it is. I was born in November. The house was completed in April the following year. And so literally I grew up in this space my entire life. And my parents always sent us to Christian schools. I like to say I started my theological and biblical education in kindergarten with the ABCs, learning them with Bible verses. A, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. B, believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. C, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And so by the time I was headed to college, I was trying to figure out, like, do I go to university? Do I go to Christian school? Like, my parents let it to be our choice. I have 6 brothers and sisters. And I had decided that because my parents had invested so much for us to go to Christian schools, I thought that maybe there was something to it. And I enrolled at Messiah College in central Pennsylvania. And so I spent 4 years there, ended up getting a degree in Christian ministries with a focus in global studies, because I had started traveling internationally, doing several missions trips and service learning trips at the age of 13. And so I had a lot of exposure to different cultures and different people groups. And I knew that my heart was really passionate for people. I actually thought I was going to do international business to, like, make my dad happy with a business degree. but God had other plans. When I was finishing up college, one of my assistant pastors, he was actually on his way to Fuller. And he said, Jeanelle, Fuller has this program. I think it would be perfect for you. You should apply. And I looked at it, and it was the Master's of Arts in Intercultural Studies program. And I naturally didn't apply. And I actually waited. This was like 2006. And so it was Urbana that fall. And so I actually ended up going to Urbana. And I remember like going to all the different booths. I actually didn't know what a seminary was when I first heard God called me to seminary. And so I'm now at Urbana, December 2006. I'm like going to all the booths. I'm an introvert, so I hate these kind of expos. It feels like Shark Tanks. I'm just like, I don't want to be here, but I need to figure out what is the seminary I'm supposed to go to. And like I'm walking past all these booths, and I hear the Holy Spirit say, no, 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 no. And then when I get to Fuller, the Holy Spirit says, yes.
Yes.
And I went to the booth, and they were the meanest people I ever met. I was like, God, not here. I was like, not here, Lord. This is not the one. But I ended up taking the time to apply, and I applied for the Intercultural Studies degree program. Then there's two. There's Intercultural Studies and Cross-Cultural Studies. And Intercultural Studies was designed for people who had 3 or more years of ministry experience, and Cross-Cultural Studies was designed for people who were just like entering into the world of cross-cultural ministry. And so I actually advocated for myself in my application that I should be in the Intercultural Studies program on the basis of the work that I had done with race and racial justice while I was in college. And it was like a Hail Mary, and I got in. And I was one of the youngest people in the Intercultural Studies program, but it was my deep joy because I got to study alongside like people who are amazing in their works, in their fields. Andy Sexton, Peter Gent, were 2 people in my cohort that I still love dearly to this day. And there's Ruthie. I don't know her last name. She got married. But yeah, it was a privilege to be in this program and learning from people who are already deep into their lives. Really, I took Bobby. Clinton. What is Professor Bobby's last name? Clinton. Thank you, Bobby Clinton's class, and we were this leadership class, and there's this question that we're supposed to look back and talk about where we have been in the past. And like 10 years ago, where were we? And I was like, I was in algebra, like in high school. And everyone else is like mapping out their lives. And this is where I was. And I was like, this program was not designed for me, but we rolling with it because I love soaking in the energy from folks. And so I did my master's in intercultural studies. I graduated during the 2008-2009 economic crash. Fuller offered me a full-time job with the intercultural studies program at academic advising. And so I said, yes, mama didn't raise no fool. Everybody else is getting laid off. Let's take the job. And then through that, I actually God called me to the MDiv program. And I ended up doing a Master's of Divinity in Ethics because I always had wanted to do a PhD in sociology. And I figured that ethics was the closest thing that you could get to sociology in a seminary. And so I began that journey. And it's through the journey of being an MDiv student that we met. It was my ethics class with Aaron Defoe Hunter. It was my birthday, and I believe it was 2011. And you were the guest speaker that day. And I remember hearing you speak and thinking like, hey, I want to take your preaching class. And so that's how we got connected and ended up doing an internship with you. I'm the worst student. I'm the worst student to mentor. Please do not envy Dr. Mark Labradin. I put him through.
It was the most unique independent study. That's true. It
was a challenge. I am a challenge. But and it was after I had graduated. And there was a lot of changes happening in Fuller, and the Pinnell Center had gotten launched. And I remember just really wanting a change. I had promised Doug McConnell that I'd give him 2 years, and I gave him 7. And I was like, I need a change. And so I went into Joel Green's office one day.
Doug McConnell was the provost at the time, and Joel Green is a New Testament professor. So sorry, I just wanted
yes. So I walk into his office. I just emailed him. I said, "Can I talk to you?" And he said yes. And I was actually that weekend. I was at a birthday party with some students and friends at Fuller, and they're like, Jeanelle, you should direct the Pinnell Center. The Pinnell Center didn't have a director. Like that's what it was designed that way. And so I walked into Joel Green's office, and I was like, I want to direct the Pinnell Center. I didn't even know if he was the right person to talk to. I just walked in. It was like, this is what I want to do. And he was like, okay. Once again, this crazy girl just asking for things that don't exist. And then he said, he's like, okay, we had a short conversation, and I left, and I didn't hear anything. Fuller, except the very next day, there was this announcement that, we were in the struggle bus again with finances as an institution. And I was like, yeah, it's not going to happen. Forget it. I'm just going to be advising the rest of my life. And then a position was announced a few months later, and my phone blew up, and everyone's like, Jeanelle, you should apply. Jeanelle, you should apply. And I applied and went through the application process, and I was offered the job. And those were challenging years. I was there for about 3 years, and they were challenging years by and large because it was the exact same time period that as a nation, we were really navigating this Black Lives Matters movement. Right? We're dealing with Michael Brown, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Sandra Bland, and it was heavy. And walking with students through this season and time was not an easy thing. I had students calling me and saying, Jeanelle, I'm in Greek, but I can't talk about Greek right now. I can't focus. And I would say, hey, meet me outside, and we'll just sit and we'll talk and process. And I found myself in this space where I'm walking with people through their grief, and I wasn't dealing with my own grief. I wasn't dealing with the secondhand trauma that I was experiencing as a Black person in America. But I was trying my best to create opportunity, networking within the Pasadena community, trying to build bridges and relationships with the Pasadena Police Department, Fuller, larger community members or community members at large. And it was a lot. And it came a time where I needed to step away. And that's when I moved to Austin, Texas. And I actually slept for 6 months. I literally slept I didn't know I was that burned out, and my stress levels were so high. I went and I talked to a chiropractor, did a stress test, and he was like, your stress levels are so high. He was like, I can't even treat you. He was like, you just need to go take walks and breathe until you can get your stress levels down enough where we can actually do something productive. And it took me 6 months. And that's the time period when I also started Mondays as my me days, really looking at intentional self-care. January 2019, I woke up and I said, let me start engaging the city of Austin and what's here. And I started engaging the conversations around the intersection between race and wellness and race and health. Got connected with Dell Medical School and their public health department and the work that they were doing with Dr. Jewel Mullen, amazing woman down at Dell Med School. Got connected with Austin Health Commons, who was working on that intersection between race and health. And it was through that process that started helping me. I joined the equity action team with the city of Austin as well, which was a community-based action group that held the city of Austin accountable for their equity department. And so just really learning about city structures when it came to race. So fast forward, I ended up launching my company, Racial Agency Initiative, focusing on pursuing racial justice with joy. How do I work with people to help them leverage their agency for racial justice and do it in such a way where we're leaning into our strengths? We're taking the best of who we are and we're saying, let's take that and talk about racial justice or lean and practice racial justice as a way of life and not as an outcome to a particular event. I was just getting this jump started and when COVID hit and I'm like, seriously? So I had to pivot all these ideas that I had, move to online, try to figure out what do I do? How do I navigate this? And then in the midst of all that, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Sean Reed, others. And it was just like hit after hit. And we're sitting there like, we're in COVID. Like we only get to go out once a day for a walk. Like why are we still getting killed by the police? This doesn't even make sense. And Breonna Taylor's death really hit home because like her murder, they rolled up into her house and killed her. And I'm like, how did we get here? How do we get here as a country where even during a pandemic that Black people are still being murdered by the police? And then on May 26th, early in the morning, I'm checking my family group chat and my brother texts, he sends a link. He says, hey, this happened right by your house. And I open up the link and it's at the intersection of 38th Street in Chicago. My family home is 38th in Oakland, which is just a couple, like 3 short blocks away, like 2.5 blocks away. And I didn't finish watching the whole video. Actually, I didn't see the whole thing until the trial because I remember when I started watching it and then I realized what it was going to be. And I said, I can't finish this because I had a flashback to Alton Sterling and Philando Castile's videos, which I watched back to back. And I remember I just couldn't stop crying. I was brushing my teeth crying. I cried all the way to work. And it wasn't until I got to Fuller that I had pulled myself together so I could be present for the students. And I was like, I can't feel that again in my body. I wasn't ready. And so what I started doing, I was like watching the response of the community. I watched as the 3rd precinct burned. And the moment that happened, I started texting my family. I was like, these are all the things you need to do. This is how you need to protest well. I text Mike Kinman, who's the rector over at All Saints Church. I text Andre Henry. I text Latina Williams or Latina Harris now, and Dominique Robinson. I text them. I said, y'all, I need resources. Like what can you think of off the top of your head that as protesters we will need in order to protest successfully? And I need to just feed this all to my family to protest well. And they were just like giving me all these things. And I'm literally just feeding it to my family and saying like, this is what you need to do. This is how you need to prepare. Make sure you have these basic things in your backpack so that way you protest well as a peaceful protester. And this is what churches can do. This is how people can be present for one another. This is how all the way down to get a babysitter, like things like that practical. And so by the time I got done sending that list, that was like on Wednesday, my family said to me, Jeanelle, come home. And I said, no. And they said, but this is what you do. This is your work. These are all the like things that we need. We need you to come home. And so, because I actually didn't want to go back because my first reaction was no, because, community organizers can be a lot like pastors where people get really territorial over their flock and their sheep. And I didn't want to navigate that. And I just figured I could just do what I can from afar and that would be okay. But then my mom and my family were like, yeah, no, we want you to come home. And so I bought a one-way ticket and I flew home. Thinking I was going to be there for 2 weeks. And I had 1 week's worth of clothes with me. And I started by engaging the protest, but that was just so traumatizing and re-triggering because I still hadn't dealt with the trauma in my body from the protest that we had done in Pasadena, and being on Colorado Avenue and cars driving through the protest, and Latina and I, we were literally putting our bodies in front of vehicles to keep women and children safe. And so when I'm in these protests, like I was in the protest when the truck was coming at us on the highway, and it just triggered everything. And I was like, I can't do this. And so I decided that I would tend to the memorial. And that would be my protest, because when I was at Fuller, if those who were at Fuller at the time would recall, that there was a lovely Black Lives Matter display on the front steps of Peyton that Julie and Eric Ty and myself tended to for the better course of a full academic year. And it was extremely disruptive. Many people did not like that there. But we needed to call attention to the lives that were being lost. And because of that experience of tending to a memorial over the course of a year, I told myself, I know how to do this. I can do this. So I would wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and I would tend to the memorial, which the people were calling sacred.
Now the memorial you're referring to is for George Floyd.
The George Floyd memorial, sorry, yes. So I would wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and I would walk like 2.5 blocks down to the intersection of 38th in Chicago, and I would just start picking up trash, straightening up signs, readjusting flowers, cleaning up candles and standing them back up, just tending to the space. To the best of my ability, drawing from the experience that I had in Pasadena with the memorial, the Black Lives Matter memorial that we had set up on the steps of Peyton Hall. And here at Minneapolis, at the intersection, the memorial grew and grew and grew. With every protest, people kept laying down offerings. And I was like, my Lord, like we can't handle all this. But at some point, like people would ask if they could help. And because they just saw me and a couple other people every day just coming, and they would ask if we could help. And my friend Paul, because he was an older white man, he would say, go ask that girl. And so they would come to me. And because I used to be a director of operations at Fuller, my mind went into, okay, how do we make this work with all these people helping? And so I started creating guidelines about how we can work together and be consistent in our work of caretaking, which actually people started calling caretaking. I just called it tending to the memorial. And then someone started calling us caretakers, and it kind of stuck. And I had a whole list of guidelines, but once like everything shook out, there was 2 guidelines that remained. And the first was everything is somebody's offering, therefore nothing is thrown away. And the second one is that the people are more sacred than the memorial itself. Now, at the time, I had no idea that it was very unique to call these items laid at a memorial offerings. And I asked people in other cities, like, well, what do you call them? They're like, oh, we call them tributes, or we call them like whatever. And I was like, oh, I had no idea. Y'all, I'm trained in theology and in church religion. Like, y'all called it a sacred space. In my head, wherever there's a sacred space, people bring offerings. That's what we do. Black church. I'm sorry. And so we just started calling everything offerings, but it fit because what we saw was it wasn't just the objects that people were leaving, but it was what people were bringing to the space. There was their public grief, their tears, their pilgrimage, their questions, their dance, their song, their shouts, their cries, their quietness, their contemplative prayers. I remember one biker had come through. He walked his bike in the square, opened up his water bottle, poured water into a planter, closed his water bottle, said a prayer quietly, and then walked out of the square. That was his offering. And so people brought whatever that they had to give. One woman brought a bassinet. And what we didn't know until it disappeared, one day she came up and she was like, where's my bassinet? And we had no idea. And one of my caretakers, Vine, had said, I had asked her about the story, and the woman had said that it was the bassinet of her deceased child who died as an infant, and she laid that as an offering. Thank God we have photos of it, tons of photos of it, actually. But she laid that as an offering. Like, I've seen photos of military veterans. I've seen photos of just family members where people are laying their tributes. It literally has become a space of public grief. There's a mourning passage in George Floyd Square where it's a list of 168 names written on the street of people who have died unjustly to the police. Some of the names we recognize because of popular hashtags. Some of the names we don't. And then there's another installation around the corner where a couple of youth from college, another state, actually flew in, installed and say their names installation, which looks like a graveyard. And it has the names, the places, the dates, the ages of people who've died. And some of them go back to Emmett Till. And then some of them are like a 4-year-old child or a 7-year-old child, people who we would never even think of, because they were before we had this kind of social media advancement of hashtags and saying people's names out loud and very boldly and publicly. And what we started to recognize as well, even the people who in our community who have died, we uplift their names, we build memorials for them. So at George Floyd Square, there are multiple memorials. It has become a space of public grief. It's become a space to lift up the names. It holds all of our grief. When the insurrection happened in January 6th, I went to George Floyd Square and wept because of the anti-Blackness that existed in the process of that insurrection of the U.S. Capitol. It hurt so bad that I went to that space and wept because I knew it could hold my public grief. And so we, as a community at 38th in Chicago, we understand this intersection to really be about everybody, about all the names, about all of our community members. It's not just about George Floyd, and we uphold it as such. Our protest is for justice, a kind of holistic justice, a kind of restorative justice. And so, yeah, that is an extremely long answer to how I was born into this house, how I got here to today. And so I will pause there so you can actually ask a question, maybe, instead of me just going on forever. I tell people I've got 11 months of stories.
Exactly.
We'll be here forever.
Give people a sense of the significance that the square now occupies, because obviously many people are following the details every day in the unfolding trial of Derek Chauvin. And
Absolutely.
In addition to that, there's this political concern within the city, of course, about their desire to reclaim the intersection, which is a really very significant traffic way, but you've held it for now 11 months. And it's as rich as you just described. All of that is there. So therefore, there's no sense that somehow this can just be, easily moved around, or that it's trivial and just kind of in a bother to the city. It's held as a sacred bother, as it were, for everyone that has entered into this in such a deep way. And even people that have only just looked at it online or seen photographs of it, I think shared a deep identification and empathy with what it is that's going on there. So give us a picture of the social reality in that sector of Minneapolis and how this is unfolding.
Absolutely. So the city has been trying to open the streets since July last year. And the community was divided on whether. Some people were like, yeah, let's reopen the streets. Other people were like, yeah, not so much. Myself and a handful of community members in our conversations, we felt strongly that if the city had reopened the streets, that they would forget about the trauma in the community, and that would not be addressed. And so when we sat down with our city council member, we said, please do not reopen the streets until after you actually bring justice to the community, because we experienced the lynching in our own backyard. And there's trauma, there's things that need to be addressed. And it's important for us to be able to do this first, and then we could reopen the streets. And well, they asked us, they said, well, what does justice look like? And basically was like, y'all got 12 hours to respond because I got a press conference tomorrow. And so figure it out. And so we ran up and down the streets asking people, what does justice look like to you? And it was such a profound moment in time because we discovered that everyone had different definitions of what justice is based off of their situation in life. So you had Black business owners who were really looking at how do I ensure that my business does not fold and go under. You had people who were unhoused, who were really looking at trying to find housing security. You had people who were unemployed or underemployed, trying to get work in their neighborhood. You had folks who were like, we've been advocating for these opportunities or policies or platforms for our neighborhoods, and they've been dismissed in the past by city council. So can you please put that as a justice need? People asking for charges to be dropped of protesters, saying like it's just not like to express your First Amendment right and then to get trumped up with charges in protesting. They're like, we want charges dropped of peaceful protesters. So there was a total of 24, and the 24th one was that the streets would remain closed until after the trial of all 4 officers. That was the 24th request in Justice Resolution 001, we called it. And they more commonly became known as the 24 demands. And what was so unique about this document is because it really showed that Black people were not a monolith, that everyone, based off of who they were and the kind of role that they played in the community, had different requests and saw different needs. Like, we remember one brother was like, there's not really much left for me, but please get jobs for the youth. Do something for the kids, do something for the youth, look after them. Like the level of like selflessness that we saw in people asking for justice and what justice looked like to them was deeply profound. And so the protests at 38th in Chicago really became shaped around a kind of restorative justice for the community. People were asking for mental health resources. I will tell you that having a militarized police, a National Guard, helicopters, media, all of this stuff enter into your neighborhood is extremely traumatizing. And it from children to having a lynching in your neighborhood is extremely traumatizing. And so there's a deep need for integrative health resources that we put on the list of demands. And this is what it looked like. And it was so funny because when we went back and we said, okay, here's our request, they looked at us and was like, well, y'all should have asked for more. That's what they said. Y'all should have asked for more. It was a really low bar. But part of the reason why we kept things minimal was because we really wanted to be achievable. Like, we're not trying to like extort our own city or our community or anything. Like, it was just like, we want this to be doable. We just want to be able to say, hey, how can we start to move the process forward of actually achieving a kind of a systemic justice, the process of making things right, of getting our community to heal. And so they said, y'all should ask for more. So we actually went back to the drawing board, created an addendum, where we actually allowed the request to speak into what that more would be. And we also expanded it to say, if we're really looking at systemic justice, we need to look at a period of 10 years and not just a period of 1 year. So that upped the price tag. And I think in the document, it's like $156 million over 10 years. And so, which actually is not that much when you're looking at like 4 different neighborhoods and investing like $15 million a year and up to, really, because we had to like create an economic value for some things that were didn't really have a number on it. So, but really investing in a large population of people, like there may be even like around like 4,000 people in that like area, larger area.
Right. Jeanelle, give us an insight into this moment in the trial as it intersects with what you've just described. So the first part of it is the trial of Derek Chauvin, and then there's 3 other officers who are going to be tried later in the summer, I think is when that's going to get underway. So, but just we'll partition the other 3 out for just a second. So right now we're in the middle of watching the Chauvin trial unfold. Give us just a read on the streets of the people that you're talking to. How are people seeing and feeling about the state of the trial at this moment?
If you ask us at George Floyd Square, it's no justice, no street still. They want to reopen the streets, but we haven't seen nothing. Well, I shouldn't say we haven't seen nothing. We've seen very little in terms of a response from the city. And so the trial of Derek Chauvin, it's heavy. It weighs on us. Not everybody's even watching it because it's hard to navigate this. Like it's secondhand trauma, like watching the lynching of George Floyd from multiple camera angles. Like that is hard to watch. As a Black person, it's hard to watch. It's hard to relive. It's hard to experience. It's brought me to my knees in tears. And it's not easy for us to navigate. And I can't even imagine being the family of George Floyd and trying to navigate that inside the courtroom. Like that this is heavy stuff. This is hard. But we still stand by no justice, no streets. And so even with, I say, with the 24th demand, where it's like, it's until the trial of all 4 officers, they lynched George Floyd. And what's so important is for people to understand is that you're dealing with a police department that has not changed. Just a week or 2 ago, on the north side, an officer punched a youth in the face. Like, seriously. We had issues with the police back in December, arrested one of our community members and dislocated his shoulder in the process because he stood up to a police officer between himself and a Black woman. And he told that officer that you will not touch a queen. Oh, he really did. And that officer got upset and decided to arrest him. And the woman wasn't even the person that they were going after for, that they were there for. She was a bystander. And so we are, the tension is thick in Minneapolis. The tension is thick. And you have to understand, like, after George Floyd was lynched, the people of Minneapolis burned that 13th precinct down, and they burned the city. Then in August, when the people of Minneapolis thought that the police department had killed a man and it was actually a suicide, they burned downtown. Like this is how thick the tension is here in Minneapolis. The racial tensions are high. People are sick and tired of being sick and tired. The racial disparities and injustices are not okay. And what we are realizing in the process of this protest, like the biggest reason why that the city wants to reopen these streets, because to give people context, Chicago Avenue, on which all of this happened, is a major bus line. It is the most trafficked bus line in the state of Minnesota. And 38th in Chicago was set to be an anchor station for a new rapid transit line, a bus that would go from the southern suburbs to the northern suburbs of Minneapolis, go through downtown, and it would get there faster because it would go every 4 blocks. It would only stop every 4 blocks. And 38th in Chicago was supposed to be a hub, and they were set to start construction on that, and it was supposed to open this year in 2021. And the protests caused all of that to come to a halt. Literally, where George Floyd was lynched was at the bus stop that was supposed to be reconstructed and rebuilt. And so in a lot of the language of the city, as they have talked to the people to say that, we're in negotiations and conversations with the community. And these are the things that we are working on. And these are the things that we want to do. And you'll notice that the Metro Transit D line is always on there because that's why they want to reopen the streets. Like when I have a person in public works approach me and say to me, is this the place where you all have to grieve? I was like, seriously, we didn't choose the location. We did not choose the spot. But this kind of push to reopen the streets so that they can put this money through. Racism works in such a way where it's always property over people. Literally, our ask for the 24 demands could have been met by the city expediently. And the reason why I know is because they spent a lot of money on putting Jersey barriers, fences, and barbed wire downtown surrounding the courthouse for this trial. Like, literally, they could have invested in health and wellness in the community. They could have invested in jobs. They could have invested in like all these opportunities, but like Jersey barriers and what, because downtown is where their most expensive buildings and investments are.
Jeanelle, you're really, really giving us such a central grounding vision of what it is that's really happening and what the issues are. I guess I have two remaining questions. First, what would you say, so far as the story is unfolding right now, what is this really actually about, this moment? And then secondly, I'm curious from a Christian point of view, how you reflect and see God's presence or apparent absence or whatever it may be in the middle of all this. So what is it about and where is God?
One thing that I've learned is that community is the antidote to racism through this process. And we protest for Black liberation. This is about Black liberation. Black people have been mistreated, abused for 400 years in this country, and we're still not free. We're still less than when we want to talk about opportunities to thrive within this country. And this really is about Black liberation. And people have to understand that when Black folks get freed, everybody gets freed in this country. It just raises the standard for the wellness of everybody. And what we've seen is that by building community, like at George Floyd Square, there's the People's Closet where people can come, like as people donate clothes, people can come and shop with dignity for clothes that they may need. We have community meetings daily, 8 a.m., 7 p.m. to be able to talk about like where we are, how are we as a community. It's mostly white folks that go there, but it's led by Black community members. But we do our best, with the memorial. I mean, like we formed the George Floyd Global Memorial in partnership with the family of George Floyd. Aunt Angela Harrelson. She's George Floyd's aunt. Angela Harrelson and Miss Paris Stevens, we collaborated to be able to govern all of the offerings that have been laid at the memorial so that people can continue to experience, because this is the memorial that the people built. The city wants to do something, but I'm telling you, the real memorial is the memorial that the people built. And so when we're really looking at community and building our capacity together and rising together. And so as we pursue Black liberation, as we pursue racial justice, we do this together in the context of building relationships. And that is extremely biblical. That's what Jesus did. Jesus walked around building relationships with people and to address systemic injustices in his time and in his day. When it comes to the faith and religious aspect, God has been in this thing so deep, y'all. Like, to preserve the offerings that were in potted plants, we built a greenhouse. I had a greenhouse contractor told me, no, don't do it. It won't survive a Minnesota winter. It's too expensive. I had a farmer tell me, don't do it. We don't use greenhouses to keep live plants through the winter. We might use them to start new ones, but not keep live plants. My community neighbors were like, I'm a builder. Let's get this done. We're going to build a greenhouse. Caretakers went out, raised the funds. We built a greenhouse and the plants survived through a polar vortex. It is the miracle greenhouse, but it took a village. It took a neighborhood. I mean, even one of the local businesses, Chicago Fire Arts Center, they actually provided electricity so that way we can actually heat the greenhouse. A neighbor saw our episode on NPR and said, hey, I have heaters for the greenhouse. Like, what do you need? And he brought in heaters. Like, this is a community effort. Everybody is working together to sustain it. Artists bringing art. The one brother who built the wooden fist in the middle of the intersection, he came and he heard people saying, man, we really wish we could get this casted in steel. Then he worked with Chicago Fire Arts to actually trace the fist and cast it in weathered steel. And then we installed it as a community on Martin Luther King Day. Community is the antidote to racism, people. Like, I can't tell you enough, because even in the midst of this protest to keep the city accountable, what we find is that we are coming together as neighbors, and we didn't all previously know each other. People living across the street from each other didn't know that each other existed. But being able to realize, like, when we come together, there's so much we can do for ourselves. And there's so much we can do for other people as well. And then I want to go back to, like, so there's the miracle greenhouse, and then the way God is moving in this. There's so many things that God is doing. I keep telling folks, God will fight our battles. God will fight our battles. Man, it came to the point people were like, I was called public theologian, square chaplain, like all kinds of things. I'm like, y'all, like, those are not my titles. Like, I'm just here to remind y'all that God will do it. As we say in the Black church, won't he do it? Yes, he will. So much so, one of my friends, she said, Jeanelle, she was like, ever since I known her, she was like, I'm not spiritual. I was like, cool. Like, one of the caretakers that I work with, he asked me if I was spiritual. I was like, yeah, I'm Christian. And I said, well, how about yourself? He's like, yep, I'm a witch. And I was like, huh, cool. All right. We're working side by side for justice. Let's do this. And one of my friends, she would always say, yeah, I'm not spiritual. And then one day she sat me down. We 9 months, 10 months into this protest. And she said, Jeanelle, she was like, this protest has drawn me closer to the God of my mother's faith than anything has ever done before. Her mother was a Christian, and was, in terms of her mother, is now deceased. But like, that kind of testimony of the way God is moving in this space, that God is showing God's self to people through righteous protests, through peaceful protests. Like, half the reason I think the reason why we've held these streets for so long is the city don't know what to do with us. Like, there we are building gardens, like food gardens, plant gardens, giving life to the community. We distributed 6,000 blankets just before the polar vortex, like doing food distributions, having block parties, allowing people like to really come together and build community. Like, what do you do when when building community and building life is our protest? That symbol of this steel fist with a garden around it is the most powerful symbol of peaceful protests I've ever witnessed. And we have the privilege at 38th of Chicago to live into that and watch God be God.
Jeanelle, I really can't thank you enough for being on Conversing today. This is such a story of witness, and it's witness at every possible level. And I am just very, very grateful for your voice, your life, your action, your resilience, your tenacity, your creativity, your humor, and as much as anything, your community building capacities, which are in you to the core. So
absolutely.
God
Now, I realize
you.
I spent like 20 minutes like talking about my early life. So if people actually want to know about the protest, y'all show up at 38th in Chicago. Come through.
I plan to. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.